Hello and welcome to Make It Conscious. This is Max. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the shadow. It's a really important topic and concept in Jung's psychology. And it's a subject that's entered the common zeitgeist. And people are always throwing about this term, the shadow projection, integrating the shadow, doing shadow work. What's this all about? On one hand, it's inherently a slightly tricky concept to understand because, well, you may well be aware the shadow is unconscious, and we can only experience and understand and think about the shadow in terms of the conscious mind. We experience the shadow as symbols. We experience it through the lens of our conscious mind, and therefore it shows up as a symbol representing something in the unconscious. But what is this thing? And so continuing on this series here, of what Jung said about the shadow, it being such a key part of his psychology, I think it's important we actually take some time to understand exactly what it is and what he said about it. And by the way, what he said about it was perhaps not as extensive or as precise as one might assume before actually reading Jung's work. So there's a book called Jung on Evil that is actually a collection of writings by Jung, prepared and introduced by Murray Stein. And it's interesting that even within that introduction, the word shadow is mentioned almost as much as it is in the rest of the book, which consists of 10 or 11 pieces of Jung's own writing, nearly 200 pages. So in the first bit of the book, the introduction, there's almost as many mentions of the shadow. This is not that Jung didn't value this concept or believe that it was an important part of his psychology, because it certainly was. It's a couple of things. It's partly because the idea of the shadow is in part an inference from Jung's work. It's implied that this is a very important part of what he coined the individuation journey, with the shadow being, in his model, the first step, or if you like, the first encounter, because it is like the opposite of our conscious persona or conscious thesis. So this first reason is that it's a kind of inference. The second reason is that it's an idea that evolved very gradually over time, over the course of Jung's life. Talking about it in mythology, he talks about the shadow of such and such, without necessarily meaning shadow in the sense that we now use it. So you can see the evolution of Jung's thought here. And not only that, even though he coined the phrase the shadow as an archetype, he didn't invent the idea as such, because this is an archetype, and it's an archetype because it's a natural and important part of collective human experience, and therefore it shows up in various forms in mythology, so it's implied in all these various ways. But Jung was really the first to make serious headway in establishing this concept in psychology, and as a key step on the individuation journey, this process of becoming who we really are, becoming a self, not separate from the world, but psychologically independent of the world and also responsible for ourselves. So Jung was really the first to coin it in that sense. However, the work also does not end with Jung. I think that's a really important thing to understand here. So even though he established the concept, necessarily so, and contributed a huge amount to this project of selfhood, let's call it, he wasn't the only one. And his thoughts very much reflect the time at which he lived. Jung was obviously very well read in philosophy. In fact, not only psychology. I mean, psychology was a relatively new science back then. He was among the first. But the early psychologists were largely drawing on philosophy. And they were also, of course, very well read in mythology. So Jung was very much of his time, and he was aware of what was coming next. He even talked about it astrologically. He wasn't making any suppositions around why astrology is important or to the extent that it works or anything like this. He was simply saying that the Christian Aion had a certain teleology, a certain style, a certain flavor, a certain meaning, and that's now changing into what comes next. And he talked a bit about the key themes of these two eras that we are spanning in our current time. That was the point of his book, Aion. And that's what we're going to be really focusing on today in this episode. I'm only going to be looking at Aion because we looked at it last week and it follows logically. Last week we talked about the ego. This week we're talking about the very next chapter, which is the shadow. And it's a very simple, barely 3-page chapter. So really concise. But also I think this is a good place to look because Aion was written towards the end of Jung's life. It was published in 1951. He wrote the intro or the foreword in 1950. But actually, according to Murray Stein, he actually wrote Aion in 1948. Either way, this is relatively late in Jung's life and career. And so presumably this chapter contains the summation, although it doesn't explore extensively, it nonetheless contains the summation of Jung's thinking at this point in time. He's 73 years old in 1948. And even within this chapter, within this book of Aion, we can see what might appear to be some kinds of contradiction in Jung's discussion of the shadow. So as I've iterated in the last few episodes here, Jung was not trying to explain reality. He was developing a psychology. He does not claim to be a philosopher. Some have talked about, Jung's metaphysics, but Jung never claimed to be a metaphysician. In fact, in the intro to Aion, he says he writes as a physician with a physician's sense of responsibility and not a proselyte. And neither was he trying to exhaust this topic, I think it's fair to say. So as much as we need to learn from those who've come before, I also think it's important that we continue taking this forward and try and resolve some of the inherent issues and contradictions within these thinkers, within Jung's thinking, around this project of selfhood, and specifically within individuation and the concept of the shadow. So we're going to be covering that as we go. But let's actually look at what Jung said. So, introduction, in the very first paragraph, this is how it begins. He says, whereas the contents of the personal unconscious are acquired during the individual's lifetime, the contents of the collective unconscious are invariably archetypes that were present from the beginning. The archetypes most clearly characterized from the empirical point of view are those which have the most frequent and most disturbing influence on the ego. These are the shadow, the anima, and the animus. So right off the bat here, Jung is describing the shadow as an archetype. So what this means is that the shadow is part of the collective unconscious. It's something that we all have an experience of and that we interpret, yes, through our personal lens, but it is a collective experience that belongs to the collective unconscious and therefore all of our psyches. So this is a bit peculiar because the shadow is often regarded as part of the personal unconscious, something that we acquire within our own lifetime. Well, it's both actually. So we each have a personal shadow, but that also has an archetypal flavor. And why might this be? Well, this is clearly because of what the shadow is. The shadow is a natural consequence of moving forth consciously and willing something about, becoming something. It's necessary that this sets up an opposite. Again, Jung didn't really explain why philosophically this ought to be or must be the case. So I don't want to go there too much now. I certainly want to talk about that more in the future, and I do talk about that in the courses I'm releasing as part of the Know Yourself program. But just for now, know that in Jung's own terms, the psyche is compensatory. And so consciousness creates polarity. It creates one-sidedness or the appearance of one-sidedness. So in personality terms, if this, say, is someone is very logical, if we like to be very logical and that's how we appear to be solving our problems in early life, that is how we're solving our problems, no doubt. But that also sets up an opposite. So even though logic may be only 50% of a fully considered, truthful decision-making process, because we need to be both partial and impartial. We need to both understand the impact on feeling on the individuals involved, and we need to understand impartially how that looks from an objective perspective. So you simply cannot make a fully informed decision without engaging both of those things. But if we become identified with the logical aspect of that equation, then what starts to happen is we start to superimpose that way of being onto mystery, onto the unknown, onto everything that we don't know. This is this directedness of mind that Jung refers to in the transcendent function, which we also covered off a few episodes ago. And it's so therefore natural that by expanding this view and this belief and this way of operating into experience, that something is necessarily left out. And even though Jung doesn't define the shadow in that precise kind of way, I'm making a case here that I think that that's what we should call the shadow. The shadow is the opposite. In other places, other thinkers have defined it as that which we find difficult to confront in ourselves. And there's a lot of overlap there, because by virtue of it being rejected and it being opposite, it is necessarily that which we find difficult to confront in ourselves. But here's where it gets a bit complicated, because so far we've only really talked in terms of the quality that's being postulated here, whether it's logic or feeling or intuition or whatever it might be. And at the same time, the quantity or magnitude with which that's put forward. The presumption being that if you put yourself forward to a sufficient degree, that this sets up such a polarized scenario that the unconscious aspect, the shadow that's left behind, must necessarily force itself into experience. So this is all true and accurate. But there's a third dimension here that perhaps we need to be clear on. And that's what I would refer to as direction. Is this movement serving freedom? Is it serving morality? Is it serving the path to selfhood itself? Or is it insisting upon itself, the self-image, stagnation, the violation of other people's freedom to the apparent benefit of one's own? Is it serving the alienated self? So the direction is whether it's wholesome or unwholesome, because you can be very, very logical to a very large degree, but you can also do that with the intention ultimately to serve spirit and to serve freedom and to serve the journey to selfhood. But you can also do it with the desire to avoid all of that, to avoid oneself, to push away mystery, to push away the unknown. And that is one way in which this difference can really be construed. It's like, what is our attitude to mystery? Are we using these various tools of the mind to work with mystery, to deepen a relationship with it, to integrate it? Or are we using it to avoid mystery, to avoid tension, to placate it, to just try and expediently bridge that gap without actually doing the work? We want our cake and we want to eat it too. So what's the direction of this quality? So this is a third aspect we have to really consider. And this really can help aid our understanding of evil itself and what it is. Is it merely a perception? Is it something that has some kind of real existence? And what would that even mean? And what does Jung say about it? Well, this is one of the areas in which Jung's thinking seems to sort of suggest both of those things to be true. That on one hand, it's just our mere perception, so judgment by the ego. But on the other hand, we actually need to recognize it as present and real. So which is the right one? Well, as a general rule, where there are two apparently conflicting beliefs going on, or stances, the truth might involve some alchemical reaction of the two, or lie somewhere in the middle. So then, just on this introduction, the shadow is very much an archetypal experience, by virtue of it having a kind of reality. It's not enough just to say that, oh, it's just your own shadow. It's just your own judgment by the ego. It's self-contradictory to say that. Because, well, A, it is itself a judgment, and B, it's presuming that we have the ability to call things as they are and other people don't, or vice versa. We haven't escaped the problem of shadow and projection there. So let's move on. So he goes on, the most accessible of these archetypes and the easiest to experience is the shadow, for its nature can in large measure be inferred from the contents of the personal unconscious. The only exceptions to this rule are those rather rare cases where the positive qualities of the personality are repressed and the ego in consequence plays an essentially negative or unfavorable role. So there's a couple of key points to take away from this. The first is that this experiencing the shadow through the personal unconscious, this is why it's so accessible. This is why it's both a personal and a collective experience, because we all must establish ourselves in the world in some way as a way to adapt the pressures that we're put under. When we're early in life and we're very, very unconscious and we're very, very attached and identified with the world, it's a process that gradually we wean ourselves out of, slowly but surely, hopefully. But in doing so, it's a question of adaptation. So we're learning, okay, kindness good, unkindness bad. Whatever it is, there's a relatively rudimentary approach to certain qualities in the early part of life. Certainly the first 6 or 7 years of life, we're learning these quite one-sided adaptations. And as we adapt and evolve further, as we get older, we tend to become, if anything, more one-sided, but more sophisticated in those primary stances. But we're always integrating with opposites. We have to, because otherwise we just wouldn't adapt at all. But by and large, that's all in service of this overarching one-sided belief in our image of ourselves and our conscious stance. And this necessarily sets up an opposite. This must create the shadow. And that's why there's a personal element to this. And that when we experience the shadow, it often has a kind of personal flavor. And before shadow work has really begun, that's pretty much the only way we can see evil in the world. And God knows that it's so easy to completely miss evil, to be completely oblivious to what is blatant attempts to drag oneself into a master-slave dynamic. And we do it to ourselves as well. We have this internal sergeant major that Freud referred to as the superego. And that's nothing more than the internalized response to what the world was already doing to us and trying to bring out of us in its own attempts to avoid itself. So if we wish to avoid ourselves, there's no shortage of supply and opportunities to engage in that mutual ignorance with the world around us. To an extent, this has to happen because the mind can only really deal with one thing at a time. And this is why shadow work is a very layered process. We have to get through the top layers first before we can get to the lower layers. So it's not really accurate to call that a defense, I would say. But beyond the point, because of this direction aspect, this role of the will and the free choice that's involved in whether we engage with our shadow or not, whether we confront evil or not, there is this capacity to then defend and avoid. This isn't something that just happens on its own. It's natural, but at the same time, it involves the ego's role. So on that, the second point here is where he talks about the exceptions to the rule, and that in some rare cases, it's the positive qualities of the personality that are repressed. So I feel this is relevant because here Jung is basically defining the shadow as the negative aspects of the personality. Now, what does that mean? Because that's a little bit ambiguous. Does it mean negative in terms of opposite, just as a negative number is the opposite of a positive number? Or does that mean negative in terms of negative, like undesirable, something we don't like? Well, in the way the shadow is discussed, sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other, sometimes it's both. And this is why I want to get really precise here, not only about what Jung and others have said, but also in putting forward my own model in this. And I'll get to that in another episode. But just for now, just highlighting this apparent ambiguity. The shadow is generally considered that which is difficult in ourselves, that we don't like to acknowledge about ourselves. So we'll be looking at other ways in which Jung has defined it in the next episode here. But today, just looking at Aion, and I think hopefully already you're getting a sense that it may be not as clear cut as we might like it to be. So it's a famous quote here. He says, "The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, but no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This act is the essential condition for any kind of self-knowledge, and it therefore, as a rule, meets with considerable resistance. Indeed, self-knowledge as a psychotherapeutic measure frequently requires much painstaking work, extending over a long period." So firstly, the shadow is a moral problem. What does this mean? Well, it means that the shadow forms because of moral judgments that are made by the mind, and that it does so because, on one level, because we've identified a certain way and believe that to be good, as it were, and therefore anything outside of that to be bad. And in a lot of places, Jung suggests that this is sort of merely a judgment by the ego. But here in this very same paragraph, he also says it's about recognizing the darkness as present and real. So we never seem to get a full synthesis of this from Jung. Is it just subjective or is it objective? Does evil exist, as it were? Or is it all just something that we merely perceive because of our own egoic judgments about what is good and bad and what we like and don't like and so on? Now, I think this is where subsequently we have to come to some kind of sublation of these two ideas. There's truth in both, frankly, right? And resolving that, I would say, is shadow work. It's coming to understand what is true to both of those positions. To what extent is this merely a perception? To what extent is it real, as it were? And what is the difference between those two things? And what about those two things is actually the same thing? So this gets into very esoteric territory, very difficult territory, very tricky and, well, by definition, commonly misunderstood territory. But this is the very territory that each of us needs to traverse to really get this. So for that very reason, because of this moral judgment, you can only integrate the shadow if you're willing to employ moral effort. So where is this ought to come from? Because if we have consciously judged our stance as the right one or the positive one, and the opposite of our conscious personality as the wrong one or the immoral one, then where is this integration supposed to come from? How can one possibly even begin that process? And if one was to say, oh, okay, well, Jung or whoever it is, your coach or your therapist, I'll just take your advice because you're telling me that the shadow is something that needs to be integrated. And I trust you to tell me the truth and tell me what's in my shadow. Are we not just doubling down on a conscious thesis there? Have we really escaped the problem of projection there and the problem of the shadow? Because all we'd be doing there is deeming this authority to be the one who knows the answers and ourselves as the one who couldn't possibly know any better. But is it not on our own judgment that we've assessed this person as capable of that? And if our perceptions are so warped and we just cannot understand what is true from what isn't, then on what basis do we assume that another person is any more capable of that than we are? So we're into very tricky territory here. What's the answer to all of this? Well, the answer, as usual, is something that's not easy to pin down in words, but I'll give it a go. It involves experience. It involves the necessary encounter with the shadow. This is how something is truly known. It's not through thinking about it. It's not through subscribing to beliefs or comments or advice from anyone else. As always, there must necessarily be some truth in what they're saying. And there's necessarily some truth in what we believe to be true. But often truth is partial, exaggerated, or symbolic. So the truth that underpins both sides is a reaction between the two. It's neither literally one nor the other. This is why this is tricky work, and this is also why that no one can do it for you. The crucible of this alchemical reaction is within you. It can only happen within your own psyche, within your own self. There's no other way around this. And why would you want one? But Jung goes on to say that, look, it's the necessary condition for any kind of self-knowledge. And I see what he's saying here. I sometimes get the impression with Jung's writing that he wrote so much that you sometimes get the impression that he's writing things very quickly and probably also just sort of whatever's coming to his mind at the time. And that's a great way to make content. But also, I sometimes wonder if he means things in this literal way. We've also got the issue of translation, of course. So I don't speak much German, so I don't know exactly how this was written originally. But to say that it's the essential condition for any kind of self-knowledge, I don't agree with that entirely, because that would be to imply that our conscious stance contains no truth whatsoever, no self-knowledge whatsoever. And this actually seems to undermine Jung's entire thesis about individuation and shadow integration. It's not that the ego is wrong and the unconscious is right. It's that actually both contain some truth. And becoming who we really are means reconciling the two. So I don't actually think that Jung meant it like that, because he knew well enough that you can have self-knowledge at every stage, and that absolute self-knowledge comes from the blending of opposites. So I think we can cut Jung some slack there. I think we have to do that. I think we have to take things in context, not just within the text, but within the wider thesis of someone's work. So moving on, he says, closer examination of the dark characteristics, that is, the inferiorities constituting the shadow, reveals that they have an emotional nature, a kind of autonomy, and accordingly, an obsessive, or better, possessive quality. I'll just pause there. So let's take the example of someone who identifies as very, very logical, and no doubt they probably are very logical, probably very good at being impartial, thinking about things objectively and so on. Okay, great. When this person is angered, or when their conscious view of themselves is called into question, are they likely to become more logical or less logical? So this is another area that's often a source of confusion. And the answer is both. So this is where we need to get very clear on what we mean by shadow. This person is likely to, if anything, probably double down on their ordinary way of operating. They're likely to become so logical and start wielding power through logic in trying to make things the way they want them to be, as a way to attenuate and regulate the amount of emotion they're now dealing with. But of course, anything that's stretched to infinity becomes its opposite. So hyper extreme logic is actually highly emotional. And also, just like hyper emotionality is not necessarily logical, but can have the appearance of being ruthless and objective and self-serving, a complete contrast to the emotionality that it purports to serve. So we're actually seeing the very coarse form of a unity of opposites here. So on one hand, this individual may well show up as very logical, but wherever there's extreme power-led logic, emotion is right there with it. So wherever someone is doubling down on their conscious stance, the shadow is right there with it. And it does help to pass them out. But sometimes both of these things might be considered the kind of shadow. To be precise here, probably what's happening is there is the literal opposite shadow, and there is also the aggressive, power-driven form of the conscious position that is also difficult to confront for that individual. They don't want to believe that what they're doing is unwholesome in some way. And maybe in some holistic sense, it isn't. Like, it all has its place. And furthermore, maybe they don't feel they have much of an option if their own freedom is being violated, or if their unresolved tension coming to the surface is just too much to handle. You know, in much the same way as if you put your hand on the hot stove, you don't really have much choice other than to remove the hand from the heat. So in this same kind of way, one can actually be rendered uncomfortable in confronting their own drive for power. So this in itself sets up yet another dichotomy. And hence we have not just quantity and quality, but also direction. We have not just the magnitude of how we're behaving. We have not just the certain flavor in which that turns up, or the cognitive function, but we also have the very application of that thesis. Is it serving self, or is it serving ego? Is it serving spirit? Is it serving freedom? Or is it serving alienation? Is it serving self-image? So there's many, many layers to this, and it does help to get precise about it. But also what Jung is referring to here, crucially, is the emotional nature of the shadow. And this arises for obvious reasons, because that polarization of the personality has occurred as a way to manage and adapt to the emotions felt in early life. There's simply no way that a 3-year-old child can maturely endure, tolerate, and assimilate everything that it experiences at that age. The ego isn't strong enough. It isn't mature enough. It cannot contain the tension. And furthermore, it's probably best that it doesn't, because it needs to adapt in order to carry through its thesis. It needs to first go out and meet the world in order to put forward its truth, because every conscious stance contains some truth. And if that wasn't put forward, there would be nothing. There'd be no journey, there'd be no existence, There'd be no order to the world. So, of course, order contains its own contradiction. It contains problems, but it also contains truth. It also contains a degree of self-knowledge. And this is necessary that it's carried forward. But by virtue of that, as Jung goes on, affects occur usually where adaptation is weakest. And at the same time, they reveal the reason for its weakness, namely a certain degree of inferiority and the existence of a lower level of personality. So this is where someone who identifies as very logical can actually bring through a less developed kind of emotionality into an interaction. They might maybe become a little bit manipulative, or they might become very, very swayed by how they feel about something subjectively. And this is very hard to spot because the directedness of mind identifies in a certain way, and it must necessarily extrapolate its model of the world into those areas which it doesn't quite grasp at this point in time. And this is a perfectly normal, natural, healthy process to a degree. There's nothing to be judged here, really, other than where it's happening as the result of a willful violation of freedom and an unwillingness to take responsibility. That, I would make the case, is actually at core the only thing that warrants judgment, because everything else can be construed as just part of the process of individuation. But even that, even the willful avoidance of responsibility, serves a twisted kind of purpose in our world. So Jung goes on this lower level, with its uncontrolled or scarcely controlled emotions, one behaves more or less like a primitive, who is not only the passive victim of his apex, but also singularly incapable of moral judgment. Right, so it's actually the ego that makes moral judgments, that defines things at a basic level as good and bad, desirable, undesirable. But as it matures and evolves and integrates with its opposite, it's then more capable of understanding what is objectively moral or not, and making choices in line with that. This is a very gradual, lifelong process. This is not a single time thing that happens at shadow work. We're always doing this all the time. It's the same process, the same circumambulation is happening at all scales at all times, of which the shadow is the shadow integration aspect is just one sort of macro aspect too. But it's therefore necessary to have that conscious awareness in order to make a moral judgment at all. So therefore the shadow is a little bit unhinged in this respect, because it's not conscious and therefore it's not capable of making a moral judgment. And so it's just acting out what it needs to act out. That can have both positive and negative outcomes. From the perspective of the ego, curiously, that can seem both positive and negative, because every side of an issue has both positive and negative aspects. The conscious ego has a desirable side, and it has a self-contradictory, power-driven, unwholesome side. Likewise, the shadow, by the same token, although it might all appear to be dark, it contains both positive and negative qualities. But because of its unconscious nature, it can then impose itself into our experience in a way that doesn't wield any kind of moral discernment. And if we remain unconscious of it, it can then only be rendered to the conscious ego in terms of itself. This is what I was getting at a little earlier here. So even though it may have been a shadow possession, it may still appear from the perspective of consciousness to be completely in line with our intention and our conscious beliefs and within our conscious personality, when in actual fact, it may well have had a massive shadow component. Right, next one. Although with insight and goodwill, the shadow can to some extent be assimilated into the conscious personality, experience shows that there are certain features which offer the most obstinate resistance to moral control and prove almost impossible to influence. I'll just pause there for a second. So experience shows, sure, this is a lifelong endeavor. It's never ending because the shadow always exists by virtue of the conscious ego always existing. There's always more there to be uncovered. Every time we discern, every time we judge anything, it sets up a kind of opposite. And the curious twist here as well is that in doing shadow integration, in doing alchemy, we don't defeat the ego or the original conscious position. We actually upgrade it in some sense. we integrate what has been left behind. So for that reason, what turns out usually as our conscious stance in the world, it turns out to actually have a great role in our destiny and purpose. So we're not getting rid of that. And that means that actually there's probably always going to be some difficulty with the shadow aspect there, or at least the potential for it. But theoretically, there's no reason why this work cannot continue and why we can't constantly be upgrading our conscious thesis of ourselves. So even though in Jung's experience this might not have happened, and that might well have been, again, a product of the time and the age of Pisces and the role of duality, and there being these stark differences, that was a really important feature of this Aion. But going forward, we actually need to be thinking, how can we actually not only integrate the shadow, but come to terms with it, build a relationship with it, make friends with it? This is quite a different thing to integrating it. There'll always be mystery, there'll always be unknown. And there's a case for just really learning to accept that and roll with it. It's actually fundamental. So also just the point about insight and goodwill. Yeah, like, I say, habit number 1 of the 7 habits is to take responsibility for your mind, for the reasons I just mentioned. Second habit is to cultivate wholesome intentions, right? Not good intentions, not kind intentions, but wholesome intentions. Those which build on the understanding of habit 1 and respect and honor freedom. And so this is like the sails of the ship, taking you in the direction towards wholeness. You could say it's the right direction, but who's to say that getting lost is wrong? Sometimes that's exactly what we need to do. All of this actually is nonetheless useful judgments made by consciousness, and they are both true and untrue. So let's move on from that. Jung said, these resistances are usually bound up with projections, which are not recognized as such, and their recognition is a moral achievement beyond the ordinary. Well, yes, they're necessarily bound up in projections, because let's think about what a projection actually is. It's the mind's rendering of something in the world in terms of itself. Well, hang on a second. Isn't that what we're all doing all the time? Yes, necessarily so. But when Jung uses the word projection, he's really referring to a very specific kind of projection. In other words, seeing aspects of one's own shadow in the world. Now, he doesn't clearly say whether that's really in the world or not, or whether it's merely our own perception. Well, let's simplify this. What's happening is that because of what's left behind necessarily having to force itself into experience, because of this compensatory action of the mind, well, if the conscious thesis is seeing things a certain way, it can necessarily only render experience the only way it knows how. And so when this thing arises, it will be seen externally. But does that mean it doesn't exist externally? No, it doesn't. It may very well be existing externally. It may, in fact, be very deliberately and willfully embodied externally. It may be showing up in a very evil form externally. It may be a genuine violation of one's own selfhood and freedom, which is therefore an unnatural situation and needs to be overcome. At the same time, the reason that may be happening is because it is precisely what is thrown out by the conscious stance. So there's no absolutism here. There's no, oh, it's just your projection. And likewise, if we encounter something in the world, we can never say absolutely it only is purely a function of the world. It may well be something that you've integrated and overcome, and it may well be that you're not trying to violate someone else's freedom, and yet it still exists as a kind of present and real external phenomena. Why is that? Well, we're getting again into sort of metaphysical territory here, and Jung wasn't attempting to do that. And I think he himself is a fantastic example of this, because in trying to establish his psychology in academic circles, and maybe having to concede slightly to the expectations of the world, not least the academic world, he was able to carry through his thesis. He was able to put his ideas forward in a very prolific and expansive way, thousands of pages of writing, and not to mention the influence he had on his students and the Jung Institute in Zurich and so on, and a whole industry of Jungian analysis. But in spite of all that, he himself necessarily had to leave something behind, which is an explanation. It's metaphysics. It's, well, why is this actually happening? And the counter would be, well, how did this projection even get here? How did this person arise with such beliefs about the world? Was that something they did consciously themselves? Isn't that a contradiction in terms? How can someone consciously cause their own ignorance? So there has to be a middle way here. And this is actually a great example of precisely what we're talking about, because Jung himself had to carry through this model, and it itself had to then brush up against its own internal contradiction. And I think that's where we're at now, and that's what we need to reconcile with. So Jung goes on, while some traits peculiar to the shadow can be recognized without too much difficulty as one's own personal qualities, in this case both insight and goodwill are unavailing, because the cause of the emotion appears to lie, beyond all possibility of doubts, in the other person. So this corroborates a couple of the comments I just made, actually. The need for insight and goodwill, sure. But also I would question this idea of that if there's no doubts that this is necessarily a sign of shadow projection, let's not rule out the role of doubt and of the role of certainty. Because if one is really, really certain that what they're seeing is really happening in the world, or in individuals out there in the world, then, well, that can accompany both an unintegrated shadow and an integrated shadow. Marie-Louise von France talks about this in her book on projection, that actually integrating the shadow equips us to see things as they really are, equips us to see evil in the world. And so even though in the case of shadow projection, it may well appear beyond all doubt in the other person, to be in the other person, well, firstly, this doesn't mean that it isn't in the other person as well. And that's a reality we're going to have to reconcile with, in addition to our own internal content. But also, just because you have no doubts, and we have to be able to actually, in the interest of genuine selfhood, stand by our own convictions. And understandably, one can only really do this reliably once some meaningful headway has been made into shadow integration. Because before that, the conscious ego is really just seeing things in terms of its own primary judgments about personality and about the world, about one's own beliefs. So there's quite a process to unfold before one can really start doing that. But it is necessary that we do in the pursuit of selfhood. We have to get to this point where we can meaningfully say, that's not a projection. That's actually something I'm genuinely seeing in the world. I'm seeing something that I understand very well. And I'm seeing a violation of freedom, a willful avoidance of responsibility, and such like. And yet again, these things may well be appearing precisely because they serve some kind of teleological purpose. It may be appearing, it may be a form of shadow, or it may not be, but it may be happening because it contains something we need to reconcile with. Not because it necessarily reflects something in us, but because we need to come to terms with its very reality. So there's a case here for really sitting with these contradictions, enduring them, taking their lesson, not trying to resolve them as soon as possible, because that sort of implies that you're just trying to make it go away, which in turn is a craving that the ego wants, right? Because it's not really willing to fully transform with the unconscious content. So there's no rush to go through this. There's no need to try and resolve the shadow material, or at least the manifestation of it. The thing we integrate is not the manifestation of shadow, it's what it represents. That's the thing we have to come to terms with. And that takes time. That's a very gradual process. Jung goes on, it is often tragic to see how blatantly a man bungles his own life and the lives of others, yet remains totally incapable of seeing how much the whole tragedy originates in himself, and how he continually feeds it and keeps going. Not consciously, of course, for consciously he is engaged in bewailing and cursing a faithless world that recedes further and further into the distance. Rather, it is an unconscious factor which spins the illusions that veil his world, and what is being spun is a cocoon which in the end will completely envelop him. So, true, very strong, very reminiscent of the time in which it was written, and like all things, true to an extent, because a man can bungle his own life because of shadow material, because of resisting that shadow material. But are we not also therefore to say that, well, the lives of others whose lives he is ostensibly bungling in turn, what's to say that they themselves don't also have contradiction that they're working through here? So when Jung says the tragedy originates in himself, does it really? Can we actually say that something originates in oneself? Because then we're back to the problem of, well, if it originates in myself and I was conscious of that fact, then it wouldn't be ignorance. And if it was ignorance, I wouldn't have been conscious of it. So can we really say that it originates in oneself? What I think we can say is that the willful avoidance of responsibility is a free choice taken by the ego. And that happens for various reasons. It's usually almost always accompanied by a great deal of unconscious material that's a great deal of trauma and a need to work through that and the avoidance of that, because that's work. And by definition, it takes effort and pain and energy. But there's also this free choice involved and the sort of assumption that, well, the world just really ought to meet my needs. Yeah, it's as much a developmental issue as much as it is the evil free choice to violate other people's freedom. So again, there's a lot of truth and a lot of utility in what Jung is saying here, but it too also seems to contain its own contradiction, which I think we need to understand and come to terms with. There's two sides to this, just like there is to everything. But nonetheless, we're here to talk about what Jung actually said about the shadow, which, well, here it is. So, though the shadow is a motif as well known to mythology as anima and animus, it represents first and foremost the personal unconscious, and its content can therefore be made conscious without too much difficulty. Okay. I don't know about that. I mean, it is difficult, but here's the thing. It's certainly within the realms of possibility. It's fair to say that shadow work is never done. It's never complete. However, it can be begun. Look, everything contains a shadow dynamic. Every decision contains a shadow dynamic. Every manifestation of will contains a conscious element and what is brought about unconsciously through limitation, through necessity. This is happening at all scales all the time. And this process is never done, certainly not within the parameters of a single human lifetime, because by virtue of existing, there's always something left out. However, it's certainly possible to make not only great strides into the sheer content like that, the core nucleus of shadow material as it pertains to your personality, the way you show up, the way you make decisions, the way you perceive the world. But there's also this, what I'd refer to as a meta lesson, which is the very understanding of the process itself and the very relationship to mystery itself, the very understanding of the need to take responsibility, the very choice of doing that. These are lines in the sand of a sort. They mark a paradigm shift between mere adaptation and transformation. So they don't mark the end of shadow work or anything. They mark the meaningful beginning of shadow work, because suddenly you're actually coming to understand the process itself. Now, until you understand the process itself, what's the meaning in it? But with that, if done honestly, comes understanding that the process is never fully complete. So we're going to end here on the final few sentences of the chapter. And this is where Jung starts to talk about the objective existence of evil itself. So he goes, with a little self-criticism, one can see through the shadow so far as its nature is personal. But when it appears as an archetype, one encounters the same difficulties as with anima and animus. In other words, it is quite within the bounds of possibility for a man to recognize the relative evil of his nature, but it is a rare and shattering experience, him to gaze into the face of absolute evil. There's so much to take away from this one quote here. The nature of evil. So look, firstly, the shadow is not inherently evil, but it very much relates to it. And by and large, we perceive much of it as evil because it's contrary to our conscious thesis. And it appears to be violating our freedom, and often is violating our freedom. But just as personal qualities and personality functions have opposites, so do beliefs. So do beliefs in things like the world is essentially good, or that we ought to just have an easy or happy or successful life. Now, maybe that's true, but here's the thing. If we wholly believe it to be absolutely true, with no exceptions, and try and capture that belief in relatively simple, one-sided belief, an assumption, it too necessarily sets up an opposite. Now, Jung didn't say this explicitly. In fact, I think we're seeing here his own tussle with the opposites in his own thought. Is the shadow evil? Is it not evil? What is evil? Is it merely subjective? Is it absolute? What can we do about it? Is the process merely a case of coming to terms with one's own evil, as he does suggest in some places? Well, then what to do about the atrocities of the 20th century, which Jung was all too familiar with and wrote about, and we're going to go there in a future episode. So you can see him sort of coming to terms with these opposites within himself. So what are we to make of this? One possibility is that the very belief in essential goodness creates the shadow and the reality of essential badness. The very belief in one's own goodness sets up the reality of one's own badness, and maybe setting up the understanding of one's own inner dichotomy demonstrates an outer dichotomy. Maybe even the belief in one's essential goodness also sets up the reality and the real appearance of real evil existing out there in the world. The willful violation of freedom, the use of freedom to violate freedom. Doesn't matter how much you integrate your shadow, there's still going to be that reality because it's being created, I would say, by the mind. Now, this isn't where Jung was going. This is not what he was trying to postulate, but I think here we're seeing at the very latter part of his career coming up against where this model helps, where we need it, and in the same breath, where it actually falls down. So this is, in the most unironic way, completely Jungian. I think Jung himself would have recognized this and honored this, understood that his work too is an example of the transcendent function in action. He's putting forward an idea, he's putting forward a model, and he's even saying, be careful of extrapolating this model into everything you experience, because that sets up an opposite. It manifests in projection as well as a bunch of other things. We start seeing our assumptions in the world, and that necessarily brings about the situation and the experience of them not being true. So with that all said, going to be delving deeper into all of this in the upcoming courses, Inner Shadow Work and Outer Shadow Work. Hope to release those very soon. I've actually got a deadline because I'm going traveling in a couple of weeks. So I'm working non-stop to get those live. The way of individuation will probably follow a little bit later, hopefully in the last week or so of the year. But I hope that Inner and Outer Shadow Work will be up within the next 2 weeks. So if you'd like to be informed when they come out, you can head over to the website. I recommend going to knowyourself.makeitconscious.com and signing up there. You can also sign up at makeitconscious.com as well. Either way, just go to one of those sites, enter your email, and you'll be informed when they are released. Courses 1 and 2 are already live. So the Make It Conscious Philosophy, only $7. And the Active Imagination course is also live. So that's where we get really practical. And it contains 7 new guided exercises that aren't released anywhere else, and around 8 hours of training on how to perform unguided active imagination. This is a really important practice as part of the individuation journey and becoming who you really are, right? It's about engaging with those parts of yourselves that are unconscious, whether personal or collective, whether it's integrating parts of your own personality and character, or whether it's deepening a relationship with the wider objective psyche. So with that all said, I hope you found that useful, interesting. I'd like to thank you for your time and attention, and look forward to seeing you in next week's episode, where we're going to be talking more about the shadow, but looking at some other writing of Jung. So building out our understanding there. In the meantime, have a great week, and I shall see you then.